The chamber stinks of rot. You are Henry Tudor, once the Golden Prince of Europe, now a swollen, broken man confined to a bed that feels more like a coffin. Your legs ooze with infection. Your body is eaten alive from the inside, and yet your courtiers still bow, still whisper, "Your Majesty," as though the crown could disguise the stench of death. But here is the question history rarely dares to ask. What does it mean to be the most powerful king in the world when even your own body has turned against you? The candles sputter. The palace is silent. And as Henry waits for the end, the ghosts of his wives, his allies, and his enemies seem to gather in the shadows. Subscribe now to enter this haunting journey, the last terrifying chapter of a king who once ruled England with fire and iron, and who died trapped inside the cage of his own flesh. The story of Henry VIII does not begin with a throne. It begins in the shadow of another. He was not supposed to be king. His elder brother, Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, bore the crown of expectation. Arthur was frail, pale, the boy whose every cough made courtiers whisper, but still, he was the hope of a dynasty born from blood. Henry, in contrast, was the second son, free from duty, raised not for the burdens of power, but for the delights of music, hunting, and books. Elizabeth of York, Henry's mother, adored him. She saw in her younger boy a spark that his brother lacked, an energy that filled halls with laughter, a face glowing with health, a body built for strength. To her, Henry was the sun after the storm of war, a living emblem of peace between the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. Yet destiny is cruel. In 1502, Arthur married the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, sealing an alliance with Europe's most powerful crown. But months later, Arthur was dead, struck down by sudden illness in Ludlow Castle. The torch of the future fell into Henry's hands. He was only 10 years old, and in that instant, the boy who had lived in freedom found himself thrust into a cage made of destiny. His mother died the following year, Elizabeth of York's body broken in childbirth, and Henry's laughter dinned. The Golden Prince was now a weapon shaped not by joy, but by the ambitions of his father, King Henry VII, a man haunted by usurpers and conspiracies. The boy who once sang in chapels would now be groomed as England's shield. Henry VII was no tender father. He was a king carved from suspicion, hardened by the Wars of the Roses, where betrayal hid behind every smile. He ruled England with accounts, spies, and paranoia, and in his son Henry, he saw not a child, but an heir to protect the dynasty he had built in blood. The young Henry lived in a gilded cage. He studied theology, languages, and law, drilled in lessons of power and obedience. He rode horses, sparred with knights, and learned the elegance of courtly dance. Courtiers marveled at him, tall, athletic, a boy with laughter like music. They called him handsome, radiant, a prince of the Renaissance. But beneath the pageantry, the boy carried the weight of absence. He had lost his mother, his brother, and his freedom in rapid succession. His father's gaze was iron, measuring every word, every gesture. Nothing Henry did was truly his own, and still Henry dreamed. He adored music, filling halls with the sound of lutes and choirs. He hunted with ferocity, charging into forests as though the chase could free him from the walls of power. He wrote poetry, sang with friends, and even performed masks. To the people, he was dazzling, England's hope wrapped in velvet and youth. Yet the seeds of cruelty were already taking root. For Henry had also learned that life was fragile, alliances fleeting, and love could vanish in a heartbeat. The deaths around him taught him a bitter truth. Destiny is never secure. It must be guarded, seized, and if necessary, defended with blood. In 1509, the cage opened. Henry VII, cold and calculating to his last breath, finally died. The kingdom sighed in relief. The court had been suffocated under suspicion and accounting ledgers, but now The dawn broke with Henry VIII, a boy of 17, ascending the throne. The world greeted him as a savior. He was everything his father was not: charming, exuberant, radiant with youth. Where Henry VII's court had been draped in silence and shadows, Henry VIII's court exploded with feasts, music, and tournaments. The Golden Prince had become king, and the people adored him. He married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, a union that brought not just love, but also the blessing of Spain. Together, they appeared as the perfect Renaissance pair: a learned, cultured king and a devout, dignified queen. Europe looked on in admiration. England seemed reborn. And yet, even in these golden days, cracks whispered beneath the surface. Henry was desperate to prove himself a warrior, to show the world he was not just the son of a miser, but the embodiment of majesty. He longed for battles, for glory, for the immortal songs of conquest. His hunger for recognition was insatiable. And behind his smile lurked a restless spirit. The prince, who had once been free of burden, was now the master of burdens too great for any man. He wore the crown like a mask, dazzling the world with pageantry, but inside, the boy who had lost his mother and brother had never truly healed. The Golden Prince had arrived, but within him, the shadows of insecurity and cruelty had already begun to stir. The coronation of Henry VIII was not simply a ceremony. It was a performance of destiny. The air in Westminster Abbey quivered with incense as choirs sang, trumpets blared, and the young king, only 17, stepped forward in robes of gold. Beside him, Catherine of Aragon, radiant in her Spanish finery, stood as queen. To the watching crowds, it seemed like heaven had descended to earth. Henry dazzled his people. He was everything England had longed for after the cold reign of his father: generous, athletic, eloquent. He emptied prisons, staged jousts, and filled the court with laughter. Nobles who had cowered under Henry VII's suspicion now found themselves feasting in endless banquets, dancing late into the night, drunk on the king's exuberance. But beneath the glitter of pageantry, another truth began to stir. Henry, raised in the shadow of loss, carried within him a hunger that no music or feast could satisfy. He wanted to be more than king. He wanted to be a legend. His early reign brimmed with bold gestures. He challenged France in war, determined to be seen as the new Henry V, the hero of Agincourt. He thrust himself into tournaments with reckless abandon, his lance shattering on opponents while crowds roared. He wrote music, poems, and theological tracts, convinced his mind was equal to the greatest scholars. The people adored him, but adoration is a dangerous fire. It feeds pride, and pride breeds suspicion. The young king, who had been raised in fear of betrayal, began to see shadows everywhere, shadows that, in time, would turn his crown into a blade. The dream of Henry's golden reign soon collided with reality. War bled England's coffers, and diplomacy proved more treacherous than any battlefield. To manage the burdens of kingship, Henry turned to shrewd advisors, men who could transform his desires into law. Thomas Wolsey, a butcher's son turned cardinal, rose as Henry's first great servant. Brilliant, ambitious, and cunning, Wolsey mastered the art of pleasing his king. He built courts, restructured finances, and staged spectacles that made Henry's power shine across Europe. But in serving Henry's glory, Wolsey also fed his appetite for control. The young king began to believe he could bend the world itself to his will. And then came the matter of succession. Catherine of Aragon bore children, but most were stillborn or died in infancy. Only one, a daughter, Mary, survived. Henry smiled. For the crowds, but behind closed doors, frustration clawed at him. He needed a son. He needed a Tudor heir who would cement his legacy and silence the ghosts of dynasties lost in civil war. The pressure warped his mind. He began to see Catherine, not as the woman who had shared his youth, but as a failure of destiny, And if his queen could be discarded in pursuit of power, what else could? This was the seed of tyranny, the belief that loyalty, love, even oaths before God, could be sacrificed to the crown. The king who had once charmed his people with music and laughter was learning a darker song, that of absolute authority, where the will of Henry was the law of England. As the years passed, Henry's thirst for power deepened, and new men rose to sharpen it. Among them was Thomas Cromwell, a blacksmith's son with a mind as sharp as a blade. Unlike Wolsey, Cromwell saw the true heart of his king, not just a ruler, but a man who craved dominion over every soul in his kingdom. Cromwell gave Henry what he desired most: control. He engineered laws that made disobedience treason. He restructured the government so that every coin, every land grant, every oath flowed through the king's hands. He whispered the idea that England did not need to bow to the Pope in Rome, but only to Henry himself. It was intoxicating. Henry, who once had danced and sung like a prince of the Renaissance, now began to taste the darker wine of tyranny. He saw enemies everywhere: rebellious lords, whispering courtiers, even priests. And with Cromwell's machinery of power, he had the means to destroy them. The jovial king of banquets and tournaments was fading. In his place, a ruler emerged who believed that England itself was his body, and that to defy him was to wound the realm. The golden reign that had begun with laughter was hardening into iron, and Henry, still young, still adored, was already beginning to walk the road that would end in terror, betrayal, and blood. The making of a tyrant had begun. The throne of England was not built on gold or marble, it was built on heirs. And Henry VIII knew this better than anyone. The Tudor dynasty was still young, fragile, haunted by the memory of civil war. Without a son, Henry believed everything his father and mother had fought for would crumble into dust. Catherine of Aragon was his partner of youth, his queen of 20 years, a woman of dignity and strength. Together they laughed, hunted, prayed. She endured pregnancy after pregnancy, her body breaking with the weight of loss. Sons were born, only to die in infancy. Stillborn children lay wrapped in silence. Only one child, Mary, survived Dot at first. Henry consoled himself. But as the years dragged on, his smiles grew tighter, his frustration sharper. He searched the scriptures and found the passage in Leviticus: "A man who marries his brother's widow shall be childless." Was his marriage cursed? Was God punishing him? And then Anne Boleyn appeared. Dark-eyed, witty, and unlike any woman at court, she refused to be his mistress. She wanted more. She wanted the crown. Henry's desire for her burned like wildfire, consuming Catherine's long, loyal reign. What followed was not just a love affair, but a revolution. To discard Catherine, Henry tore England itself apart. He broke with the Pope, defied Rome, and declared himself the supreme head of the Church. Of England, Catherine was banished, her daughter Mary disinherited, and the queen who had once been adored was left to die in solitude. For Henry, this was victory. For Catherine, it was betrayal. For England, it was the beginning of an age where queens became pawns and love itself became a weapon of power. Anne Boleyn stood where Catherine had fallen, crowned queen in a blaze of jewels and music. She was clever, ambitious, and confident that she could give Henry the son he craved. For a while, it seemed she had transformed the kingdom. England had a new queen. The church was remade, and Henry basked in triumph. But Anne's womb, too, betrayed him. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but her sons never lived. Miscarriage followed miscarriage. Each loss darkened the king's temper. Each failure chipped away at his love. Anne, once his obsession, became his frustration. At court, enemies circled her. Her sharp tongue, once intoxicating, now branded her arrogant. Whispers spread of witchcraft, adultery, betrayal. In truth, Her greatest crime was her failure to give Henry a living son, done in May 1536. Anne was arrested. She was accused of treason, adultery, even incest charges that even her enemies knew were woven from lies. But truth mattered little in Henry's England. The Queen who had given him a church was dragged to the Tower of London. On a scaffold, she knelt before a French swordsman. With one swift stroke, her head fell. Henry wore white the day after her death. Days later, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. The message was clear. Queens were not partners. They were vessels. And when they failed, they were discarded like broken glass. Jane Seymour was everything Anne was not: gentle, quiet, obedient. She did not fight Henry, she soothed him. And in 1537, she gave him what he had longed for, a son, Edward. Bells rang across the kingdom, feasts were held, and Henry wept tears of triumph. But joy curdled into tragedy. Jane died soon after childbirth, her body undone by the effort. For once, Henry was stricken. He wore black for weeks, ordered a grand funeral, and swore she was his true wife. Yet even his grief carried a cruel irony. The Queen who gave him a son could not live to see him grow. Still, Henry's hunger did not end. The years passed, and he sought another bride. He married Anne of Cleves for alliance, but cast her aside within months, claiming he could not love her. His next queen was Catherine Howard, a girl of barely 17, vibrant and reckless. For a time, she revived the aging king, making him feel young again. But whispers followed her, rumors of lovers before her marriage, rumors of secret meetings after. Whether true or exaggerated, it did not matter. In Henry's eyes, betrayal was death. Catherine was dragged to the Tower, trembling and pleading for mercy. In 1542, the executioner's axe silenced her. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Wives became stepping stones on Henry's desperate path to immortality. Catherine of Aragon, discarded. Anne Boleyn, executed. Jane Seymour, dead. Anne of Cleves, rejected. Catherine Howard, executed. Each queen broken by the crown, each story ending in sorrow. For Henry, it was always about the son, the heir, the dynasty. For the women beside him, it was about survival in a game no one could win. The English crown had always bowed to Rome. For centuries, kings and queens knelt before the Pope, their crowns blessed by the authority of Christendom. But Henry VIII shattered that chain. What began as a king's obsession for a son became a revolution that tore faith itself apart. When Pope Clement refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's patience snapped. He had pleaded, argued, but Rome would not yield. And so Henry decided that if the Pope would not bend, England would break free. With Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer at his side, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. It was not a theological debate. It was an act of power. From that moment, loyalty to Rome became treason, and loyalty to Henry became salvation. Churches stripped away papal symbols. Monks and priests swore new oaths, not to God in Rome, but to the king in London. The people were stunned. To them, it was not merely politics, it was their souls. Could a king declare himself God's voice on earth? Could salvation be rewritten by royal decree? The whispers of fear turned into cries of rebellion, and the land trembled. Henry had won his freedom, but at a cost. His kingdom was divided, and his own conscience was beginning to crack under the weight of his new godlike power. Thomas Cromwell became the architect of Henry's new order. A man of low birth, he rose to heights unimaginable, wielding law like a blade. He masterminded the dissolution of the monasteries, sending royal commissioners to strip ancient abbeys. There, gold and silver melted into the king's coffers, while monks and nuns were cast into the streets. For Henry, this was triumph. He enriched his crown and crippled the church that had defied him. But for the people, it was devastation. Sacred spaces that had stood for centuries were torn apart. Relics smashed, libraries burned, holy houses turned into rubble. England's landscape was scarred. Its faith mutilated, and Cromwell's power grew. He maneuvered marriages, alliances, and laws with ruthless precision. He whispered in the king's ear, feeding Henry's vision of an England reborn in his image. Yet power beside Henry VIII was a dangerous gift. The king's suspicion grew sharper. With age, he began to see in Cromwell not loyalty, but ambition. The same man who had raised him could, perhaps, betray him. The downfall came suddenly. In 1540, after the failed marriage with Anne of Cleves, a union Cromwell had arranged, Henry's fury boiled over. Cromwell was arrested, dragged before his enemies, and condemned. The man who had given Henry his crown of absolute power was executed in the Tower. The message was unmistakable. No servant, no matter how faithful, was safe under the shadow of the king. By now, religion in England had become a weapon of fear. To defy the king's church was treason, punishable by death. Men and women were burned alive for holding the wrong prayer, for clinging to the Pope, or for rejecting Henry's supremacy. The air was thick with smoke and terror. Henry himself was torn. He had defied Rome, yet he never abandoned many of the Catholic traditions he grew up with. He called himself a defender of the faith, even as he redefined it. His soul was divided half, clinging to the old church, half demanding obedience to the new. To his people. He became not a shepherd of faith, but a lord of fear. His name, once cheered in festivals, was whispered in dread. He was the king who broke their altars, who spilled their blood, who declared himself God's anointed on earth, while his own sins piled higher than any cathedral spire. By the end of the 1540s, Henry VIII had become less a man than a shadow over his kingdom. Religion, once a comfort, was now a battlefield. Families were torn apart, neighbors betrayed one another, and the church bells that once rang for salvation now tolled for executions. Henry had won the war against Rome, but in the process, he had torn apart his kingdom and his own soul. Once, Henry VIII had been the very image of majesty. His body was his crown as much as the gold on his head. Tall, broad-shouldered, a warrior on horseback, a champion in jousts. He had charged into tournaments, his armor gleaming, his lance shattering on rivals as the crowd thundered his name. He was England's son, blazing with strength. But time is merciless, and power cannot shield flesh from decay. By his 40s, the king's radiant body began to betray him. A terrible accident during a joust in 1536 left him unconscious for hours, his leg crushed and forever wounded. From that wound festered ulcers that never healed, oozing with infection, their stench filling his chambers. He could no longer run, no longer fight. The hunts that had once freed his spirit became impossible. His body swelled grotesquely, his waistline expanding beyond measure. Where once he had been called handsome, now he was whispered about as monstrous. His body, once his weapon, had become his prison. Courtiers pretended not to notice. They bowed low, flattering him with words of vigor and majesty. But the truth could not be hidden. The king was rotting while alive. Each step was agony. Each night was fever. The warrior who had conquered hearts was conquered by his own flesh, and with each throb of pain, his temper sharpened. Rage became his constant companion. Henry's court became a theater of silence. Servants tiptoed through the corridors, fearful of the king's eruptions. His wounds leaked constantly, so his clothes and bedding had to be changed several times a day. Physicians were summoned, but they offered only leeches, poultices, and prayers. None could heal him. The once vibrant king was now carried in chairs, moved like an invalid, hidden from the eyes of the people who once adored him. He avoided mirrors. He avoided truth. For Henry, whose vanity had once thrived on pageantry, the reflection of his ruined body was unbearable. But it was not just pain that consumed him, it was suspicion. His body's weakness magnified his paranoia. He lashed out at courtiers, nobles, even friends. One careless word, one hesitant glance, could mean imprisonment or death. Men trembled in his presence, not because of his power, but because of his fury. Those who survived in his orbit became masters of flattery. They told him his mind was sharp, his reign glorious, his enemies trembling. They bowed and kissed his hand, though the stench of decay clung to it. The truth was unspeakable. The king they praised was dying from the inside out. Henry filled the silence with distraction music, feasts, even new queens, but nothing could disguise his decline. The mask of majesty was cracking, and behind it was only a man swollen, crippled, and consumed by bitterness. By the final years of his life, Henry's body was a battlefield he could not win. He weighed over 300 pounds. His legs could scarcely support him. The ulcers festered so badly that some whispered his flesh was rotting alive. The air of his chambers reeked of pus and sweat, masked only by heavy perfumes. He could not climb stairs. He could not ride horses. The king who had once thundered across battlefields was now confined to his bedchamber, the walls closing in like a coffin. Even in council, he was carried in on chairs, draped in jewels to disguise the ruin beneath. And yet, even in this broken state, his wrath terrified England. Courtiers feared approaching him, for his mood swung from tender kindness to murderous rage in moments. One smile could be followed by a death warrant. His body may have collapsed, but his words still killed. Alone at night, the king was haunted by memories. He remembered the boy who sang in chapels, the golden prince who dazzled Europe, the warrior who had once been adored. But those ghosts mocked him now. He had become a shadow of himself, trapped in flesh that betrayed every memory of strength. The fall of Henry's body was more than decay. It was humiliation. The man who had ruled with fire and iron could not even rule his own bones. His courtiers bowed to him, but in their eyes he saw the truth. A king defeated, not by enemies, but by his own flesh. And still, he clung to his crown, desperate to outlive the whispers of death that echoed through his palace. By the winter of 1546, Henry VIII was a man unrecognizable from the golden prince of his youth. His body was swollen beyond repair, his ulcers reeking, his eyes clouded with pain. He could barely rise from his bed without being hoisted by servants. And even then, every movement was agony. But the decay of his flesh was nothing compared to the torment of his mind. The king who once commanded armies was now consumed by fear, fear of betrayal, fear of damnation, fear of death itself. He had executed friends, wives, and counselors, but in his final days, their shadows returned to him. At night, the king muttered to himself, his lips quivering with names: Anne, Catherine, Thomas, Wolsey, more. He saw their faces in dreams, their eyes accusing, their voices whispering of judgment. Sometimes he shouted into the darkness, commanding silence. Other times, he wept. No priest could ease his conscience. No prayer soothed his dread. For all his power, Henry knew he could not command mercy. His paranoia deepened. He dismissed servants, accused loyal men of treachery, and demanded silence around his bed. The palace grew as hushed as a crypt. In those final weeks, majesty itself began to unravel. The king who had filled halls with music, laughter, and the clash of tournaments was now surrounded only by whispers, the rustle of sheets, the smell. Oh, fraud! England's greatest monarch was dying, and there was no grandeur in it, only the slow collapse of a man who had once believed himself immortal. Even as Henry's body failed, the machinery of power churned around him. Edward Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour, the only queen who had given Henry a son, moved quietly, securing influence over the boy Prince Edward. He flattered the king when he could but his eyes were on the future. Courtiers tiptoed in and out of Henry's chambers, performing the rituals of obedience while already preparing for the dawn of a new reign. They no longer looked at Henry as a king, but as a corpse in waiting. Behind their bows and titles lay calculation. Who would rise and who would fall when the crown passed to the child king? Henry sensed it. He saw the glances, the eagerness, disguised as grief. He knew the game of power, and he knew that even his crown was slipping from his hand. It enraged him, but he was too weak to fight it. His fury, once a weapon sharper than any sword, had dulled into breathless threats. Still, he clung to the remnants of control. He demanded reports of his kingdom, ordered councils, signed decrees with trembling hands. But even his signature betrayed him, letters jagged, lines unsteady. A king's command reduced to a shaky scroll dot as the days shortened, his chamber darkened. Candles flickered against the heavy tapestries. Priests prayed by his bed, but Henry pushed them away as if afraid their words would seal his fate. He wanted time, more time, yet time was his most merciless enemy. By January 1547, everyone knew the truth. The King of England was already a ghost. On the night of January 27th, 1547, silence engulfed Whitehall Palace. No choirs sang, no trumpets heralded glory. Instead, the room stank of sweat, pus, and death. Henry VIII, once the most powerful man in Christendom, lay gasping for air, his massive body collapsing in on itself. Those closest to him kept their distance, hovering like shadows. Few dared touch him, fearing his wrath even now. When his confessor asked if he would prepare his soul, Henry only turned away, as though even in death he would not kneel to another power. Pride clung to him like a shroud dot as the hours passed. His breathing grew ragged. Memories flickered in his mind, his brother Arthur's death, his coronation, the laughter of Anne, the tears of Catherine, the cries of Jane as she gave him his long-desired son. Faces of the dead circled his bed like specters. He had built his reign on fire and steel, but in the end, they returned to claim him. When the final moment came, there was no majesty, no crowd, no applause, no glory, only silence. The king who had once thundered across England's fields exhaled his last breath like a whisper. Outside, the wheels of succession turned at once. Edward Seymour and the council moved swiftly, securing Prince Edward as king. The crown passed, the rituals continued, and England braced itself for the rule of a boy. But the memory of Henry VIII did not die with him. His reign left scars on queens who perished, on courtiers who fell, on a kingdom torn between faiths. He had been glory and terror, builder and destroyer, lover and executioner. The man who had called himself majestic left the world not in splendor, but in stench and silence. And yet, centuries later, his shadow still looms, a reminder that power cannot outlive the body that wields it. The story of Henry VIII begins with light, a golden prince, radiant with youth, strength, and promise. He was the boy who was never meant to rule, yet destiny placed a crown upon his head. In those early years, he dazzled his court, jousted with brilliance, and charmed with the ease of a king who seemed chosen by fate itself. But history teaches us that light casts the darkest shadows. With every decision, Henry's splendor dimmed. His love became obsession, his need for power became paranoia, and his hunger for legacy consumed all who surrounded him. Queens were sacrificed, faith was torn apart, and loyalty became a death sentence. The king who once promised glory instead built a kingdom of fear. By the end, majesty itself had rotted away. The warrior's body was broken, the lover's heart was hardened, and the tyrant's soul was haunted. He died not as the golden prince he once was, but as a man suffocated by silence, his own legacy poisoned by cruelty and blood. And yet Henry VIII endures, not as a man, but as a shadow across history. His choices shaped dynasties, reshaped religion, and carved scars that echo through England to this day. The boy groomed for splendor became a cautionary tale of how power, when unchecked, devours the very man who wields it. The crown had promised him immortality, but what it delivered was a prison. If this story gripped you, if the rise and fall of Henry VIII made you see the crown not as glory, but as a curse, then join us on this journey deeper into history's darkest chambers. Because Henry was not the first king to be destroyed by his throne, and he would not be the last. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the next chapter in our series of rulers who shaped the world not with wisdom, but with fear. And if you want to keep the story alive, share this video. Let others witness how a golden prince became a dying tyrant. History is not a tale of the past. It is the mirror in which we see ourselves. And Henry's reflection still stares back at us.